We live in a frightening world. Back at home in the United States, I read that the number one disorders treated by psychiatrists and psychologists are anxiety-related disorders. We are a frightened people, and with good reason. 9/11, terrorism, war, economic collapse, an uncertain future. There are many reasons for fear. Have you ever wished in such a context that you would have the opportunity to sit down with Jesus, sit down with Him face to face, and ask Him some questions about what to do when life gets scary? Maybe we do have that opportunity in the pages of Holy Scripture. I go to the Gospel of John, the 14th chapter. This is a well-known and much beloved passage. In fact, I have memories as a young boy when our family would gather for family devotions, and my father would at times say, "Let's each repeat our favorite verse of Scripture." This was the verse that my mother often repeated. In reading it as an adult, it strikes me that in what Jesus here says, He is answering some questions. The questions are not written here. They're unspoken questions, maybe in the minds of the disciples, certainly in my heart. But I think He may answer those questions, 4 to be exact. The first question is a simple one. Jesus, what do we do with our fear? He speaks to that in John 14 and verse 1. He says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me." Jesus, what do we do with our fear? He says, trust. That's a wonderful word, but not an easy word to live out. Trust. I read one Christian psychologist who tells us that when we are afraid, what we want to do is control. Get control of things around us, control people, try to control circumstances. And yet Jesus here says, when you're afraid, trust. What a challenge. How difficult to do. I was not a snow skier in my growing up years and have only begun snow skiing in my adult life. It's not a pretty sight to behold. Just a couple of years ago, I was coming down what to me seemed an awfully steep hill. I was making my way from one side to the other in these long, slow maneuvers, not to go down the hill too quickly. At one place, I had paused to get my breath, to get my wits about me. And while I stood there, I heard some yelling on the hill behind me. I heard somebody yelling out, "Left, right, left, right." I thought, how odd. I was a bit precarious, but I tried to turn as much as I could without endangering myself. And I saw a sight I could almost not believe. I saw 3 men skiing. They were all wearing orange suits. There was one a ways in front, one a ways in back, and one in the middle. And they were each one wearing a sign that said, "Blind skier." The gentleman in the middle was blind. There were the gentlemen in front and behind in these sweeping movements, moving down the hill at what to me seemed way too fast a pace. And they were simply calling out, "Left, right," and there came the blind skier right between them. Down the hill they went and left me behind. I stood there, my mouth must have been agape, thinking, he must trust them unbelievably deeply to be able to do that. It reminds me of Jesus' word here. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust. Jesus, what do I do with my fear? Jesus says, you trust. But I have a second question. It kind of grows out of that first question. I want to put my trust in Jesus, But sometimes I'm a bit frightened, a little bit afraid that what if He forgets me? What if there's not room for me in His plan? And so I press home my question to His heart. Jesus, is there really room for me in your plan? Can I put my trust in you with that confidence? Listen to what He says in John 14 and verse 2. He writes, he says, and John writes, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms. Could I put that in our vernacular by saying that Jesus simply says, there is room for you, not only in my house, but in my plan. I will not leave you out. I suspect that one of the deepest pains and maybe one of the greatest fears in the human heart is that we will be pushed out, marginalized, forgotten. We are most aware of that, and maybe it is most acute in our childhood years. Those years when we are very keen to be a part of the group. Maybe that's why I think back to that one-room schoolhouse I attended in my 8th grade year. I think back with sorrow, because in that one-grade schoolhouse, that one-grade room, rather, there were 6 students, 5 boys, and 1 girl. I didn't recognize it, I didn't realize it at the time, but I certainly realized it as an adult. I look back to that year and I think, the 5 of us boys banded together. We were great friends. We had great fun. But I now recognize that we pushed her out. That by our behavior, if not by our words, we said, there's not room for you here. I have often wished I would run into that woman now in my adult life, so that I might say to her, I am sorry. We must have caused you great pain. Because to be left out, to be told there is no room, is a deep pain indeed. I take great comfort, therefore, in the words of Jesus when He says, in my Father's house are many rooms. There is room for you. So we can place our trust in Him because there is room for us in His plan. But then I have a third question. Having said that we can trust, having said that there is room for us in His plan, I want to make sure He won't forget. And so I say, Jesus, in this frightening world, can I be certain that you will not forget me? Verse 3 of John chapter 14 says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may be where I am. Paraphrase, I will not forget you. I will come back to take you to be with me. The author Keith W. Jennison tells us the story that transpired in the American Civil War of a young man named Billy Brown who showed up in Washington, D.C. to see the President of the United States. Walked up to the White House and said, I'm here to see the President. Well, they said, I'm sorry, but he's busy. He pressed his request home. You tell him Billy Brown is here. When the word reached President Lincoln, that tall, angular figure appeared in the doorway. Where's Billy? He said. And Billy was ushered into the White House. They sat and talked for a long period of time. Billy told him about home back in Springfield, who was getting married, who was getting buried, all that was going on. Nearing the end of the conversation, Lincoln said to Billy, now Billy, I want you to tell me, what has brought you here? Do you have a request, a need? Billy said, "No, Mr. President, I just wanted to see you. I just wanted to tell you some of those stories before I forgot them." Lincoln's eyes narrowed and he said, "Billy, do you mean to tell me you came all the way from Springfield and you don't have a request, a favor to ask, a complaint to make?" And Billy said, "No, Mr. President, I just wanted to be with you." Lincoln's eyes filled with tears. And he said, "Billy, you'll never know how much good you've done me. To know that you haven't forgotten a friend." That's the promise of Jesus to you. He says, "I will come back and take you to be with me where I am," because He is your forever friend. Trust, because there's room for you in His plan, a plan in which He will not forget you. The fourth question must be obvious. It's the question in your heart. It certainly is the question in my heart. And that's the question, how? How do I get all of this? If this is indeed true, I want that in a frightening world. Listen to verse 4 and the first part of verse 6. "You know the way to the place where I am going," Jesus says. And then He answered and said, "I am the way." What does that mean? It means simply that Jesus is the way to all of what I have just spoken of. To trust, to a certainty that there is a place for you in His plan, to the confidence that you will not be forgotten. Jesus is the way. Jesus Himself. He is what we need when life gets scary. A pastor named Ron Mell writes the story of a parishioner of his who became ill, a very grave illness that would lead to that person's death. This woman was steeped in Scripture, and yet as the illness began to rob her of different faculties, she began to forget things. Those who loved her and cared for her noticed that as more and more left her, she clung to one passage of Scripture. It was 2 Timothy 1:12. She would repeat it. She would say those words, "I know the one in whom I have believed. I am persuaded that He is able to keep what I've committed to Him against that day." But the days passed, and she forgot part of that verse. But she would still repeat the part she remembered. "I know Him, I have believed, will keep what I've committed to Him." A few days later, she remembered even less. "I know Him." Pastor Mell says that toward the very end of her life, she only remembered one word. But she repeated that word again and again. It was the word Him. Him, she would say. Him. Him. At the very end, it was all that she had left, but it was all that she needed.